Hello, and how are you guys doing? So we're looking at the time period in American literature from 1820 to 1865. And when we're looking at this particular time period, we're looking at a lot of changes that are being made. We've just had the new Constitution that has been given to the people from the Revolutionary War. And so you have people who are looking at this and they're saying, hey, I want to be included in all of these freedoms that this Constitution holds for all of the people as well. So we're looking at what I would call this as being maybe the ism period, in which we see feminism, we see abolitionism, we're still seeing expansionism. So all of these different people coming together to look at this Constitution and say, hey, I want to be included in this also. So when we're looking at this, we're also looking at the writers who are writing about this particular information and these groups of people who want to be included. So when we're looking at a time period in which we have what many people call the American Renaissance. So we're looking at writers who are considered to be a part of a literary renaissance, and their writings are heralded as the first really mature and significant works by Americans. Writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and Walt Whitman are seen as central figures to this so-called American Renaissance. Most of these writers were not celebrated this way in their own time, but were identified retrospectively, almost a century after their publications, as part of this Renaissance. More recently, scholars and critics have begun to challenge the idea of an American Renaissance, noting that the formulation has tended to exclude the contributions of women and minority writers of the period, especially African Americans. They also note that studies of the American Renaissance have not paid enough attention to issues such as slavery, immigration, and other political and social contexts that shaped the writing of this time period. Nonetheless, the idea of an American Renaissance remains influential and shapes the structure of the anthologies such as the Norton. American literary nationalism is also a part of this national movement that we see during this time period. While the 1830s through 1850s is usually identified as the period when American literature came into its own, the 1820s were actually the years when critics first agreed that the United States had produced writers who wrote distinctively American works worthy of a great nation. This interest in producing identifiably American works and celebrating these works can be called literary nationalism. In the wake of the American victory over England in the War of 1812, a new confidence and sense of national identity emerged. Many Americans saw their country as a place of democratic ideals that afforded opportunity to ordinary people, rather than rewarding unearned social distinction or inherited wealth. Writers like Washington Irving, William Cullen Bryant, and James Fenimore Cooper achieved international reputations as distinctly American writers. Still, most Americans, and certainly most American writers, regarded their literature as not necessarily distinct from, but rather in conversation with English literary traditions. American writers in this period did not write uncritically patriotic text. Instead, their works reflected and participated in anxieties about the future of a young nation grappling with divisive issues such as slavery, states' rights, national tariffs, and other matters. Many writers and artists in the 1820s placed a special emphasis on the importance of America's natural landscape for the development of national character. So the literary marketplace in an expanding nation is also a major talking point during this particular time period. So by the 1920s, Americans had easy access to British literature and criticism, which, thanks to lax international copyright laws, could be republished and redistributed in the United States almost immediately after publication in London. Technological developments in printing and the expansion in railroads, canals, and other forms of transportation allowed for fast, extensive, and economical distribution of printed matter. Land acquired through the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo following the war with Mexico transformed Americans' sense of the West and the amount of land available for settlement and exploitation. Travel literature about westward expansion became a popular genre. Americans became increasingly interested in literature centered on urban life in this period, in large part because of the tremendous growth in the populations of Boston, Philadelphia, and New York resulting from the Irish immigration and the influx of rural people into the cities. Newspaper and magazine publishing exploded between 1825 and the 1860s, providing American authors with new forms for their poetry, fiction, essays, travel writing, and political reportage. Writers such as Edgar Allan Poe, Lydia Sigourney, Margaret Fuller, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Fanny Fern, among many others, were regularly published in periodicals. Women found ways to enter the antebellum literary marketplace, often by publishing in magazines. Their participation in the print public sphere raised questions about how women should balance private, domestic responsibilities with public participation. Writers such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, Lydia Maria Child, and Margaret Fuller, among many others, answered these questions in different ways. Looking at Renaissance reform and conflict, we see that many antebellum writers wrestled with the conviction that American literature and culture were not living up to their revolutionary and democratic promises, and many of these writers incited and participated in various efforts at reform. But during this time, there were also a variety of notions about what constituted reform. Emerson viewed reform as central to his cultural moment and was active in opposing slavery, affirming the value of temperance and supporting women's suffrage. He is more noted, however, for his founding role in what many literary historians have termed the Transcendentalist movement. Emerson's transcendental writings amounted to a call for philosophical and literary reform. Transcendentalism was never really a formulated movement, but its principles certainly inspired the writing of Fuller, Thoreau, and Whitman, among others. It emphasized the creative powers of the individual mind, the regenerative value of nature, the limits of historical associations and traditions, the stultifying effects of established institutions, and the mystical glories of infancy and childhood. Writers such as Hawthorne and Melville were influenced by transcendentalism when they grappled with the difficulties of making sense of a universe in which meaning derives from individual creative insights rather than received authority. Concerns about the urban poor and working class immigrants also had an important place in antebellum reform efforts, as writers sought to expose readers to the plight of the impoverished in order to prompt philanthropic interventions. The antebellum period saw a push for women's rights, and particularly women's rights to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton presented her Declaration of Sentiments based on Jefferson's Declaration of Independence at the first Women's Rights Convention in 1848. Many women writers were also active in the temperance movement to outlaw alcohol. Many antebellum writers took as one of their main subjects the paradox that a nation founded on principles of freedom and equality was implicated in ongoing national crimes, the near genocide of American Indians, the enslavement of black people, and an expansion that ignored other national sovereignties, including Mexico. Native American spokespersons and writers like Black Hawk and William Apess, among others, criticized white Americans' deceptive treaties, land-grabbing policies, and cruel violations of Native American human rights. Resistance to slavery and critiques of white racism were among the principal topics of antebellum African American writers like Frederick Douglass, Francis Harper, and William Wells Brown. Some Northern white writers were also active in the push for abolition, perhaps most famously Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose Uncle Tom's Cabin was the best-selling novel of the period, and for which many felt led the way to the Civil War. Irresolvable differences between the North and the South culminated in the Civil War, a bloody conflict that cost the lives of over 600,000 Americans before the South surrendered in 1865. After the war, writers struggled to come to grips with the devastation the war had wrought, as well as the racism, political corruption, and materialism that undermined efforts to follow through on the reformist potential of the North's victory. The small and large world of American writers from 1820 to 1865. In our world at that time, the authors included in this volume of the anthology were often in conversation with one another, and the number of instances of direct and indirect influences, counter-influences, friendships, and productive disagreements are stunning. Most of the writers represented in this anthology also ranged beyond the borders of the United States, either through personal travel or publication. All of the writers regarded the literature of the United States as part of a larger world literature. Writers in this anthology were also interested in much more than their contemporary moment. They were influenced by literature from a wide range of time periods and by literature and culture from around the globe. Many antebellum writers sought not only to uncover, but also to create American literary traditions. Some did this by looking back to earlier colonial texts and trying to create a sense of conformity or continuity with and from them. Many antebellum authors who are today considered canonical were not widely recognized in their own time. Melville, Whitman, Thoreau, and Dickinson all found their most enthusiastic readers in the 20th century. In this way, their work, and the work of many others represented in this volume, engaged as much with the future as with their own time. Many events took place after the Revolutionary War that led the country into the direction of the Civil War that was soon to follow. In 1820, there was the Missouri Compromise that admitted Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and excluded slavery in the Louisiana Territory north latitude 36 degrees by 30 degrees. In 1821, Sequoyah, George Guest, invents the syllabary in which Cherokee language can be written. In 1823, the Monroe Doctrine warns all European powers not to establish new colonies on either American continent. In 1825, the Erie Canal opens, connecting the Great Lakes region with the Atlantic. In 1827, the Baltimore and Ohio is the first U.S. railroad. In 1827 to 28, the Cherokee Nation ratifies its new constitution. The newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, is founded. In 1829 to 37, President Andrew Jackson encourages westward migration of the white population. In 1830, Congress passes the Indian Removal Act, allowing Jackson to negotiate treaties with the eastern tribes for their relocation west of the Mississippi. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison starts the Liberator, anti-slavery journal. Nat Turner leads a slave rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia. Approximately 60 whites were killed, and 200 blacks are killed in retaliation. In 1837, financial panic occurs. Failures of numerous banks lead to severe unemployment that persists in the early 1940s. In 1838, around this same time, Underground Railroad begins aiding slaves escaping north, often to Canada. From 1838 to 1839, the Trail of Tears, Cherokees were forced from their homelands by federal troops, in which thousands lost their lives. In 1840, founding of the Washingtonian Temperance Society. Temperance quickly emerges as one of the most popular social reform movements of the period. In 1844, Samuel Morse invents the telegraph, which leads to the Morse code. In 1845, the United States annexes Texas. In 1846, David Wilmot, a congressman from Pennsylvania, proposes in Congress that slavery be banned in territories gained from the Mexican War. His proviso is defeated. In 1846 to 48, the United States wages war against Mexico. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo cedes entire Southwest to the United States. In 1847, Brigham Young leads Mormons from Nuevo, Illinois to Salt Lake, Utah Territory. In 1848, Seneca Falls Convention inaugurates campaign for women's rights. In 1848 to 49, beginning years of the California Gold Rush, which brings hundreds of thousands of new settlers to California. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act of the Compromise of 1850 obliges free states to return escaped slaves to slaveholders. In 1854, the Republican Party formed, consolidating anti-slavery factions. Kansas-Nebraska Act approved by Congress. The act repeals the Missouri Compromise, making it legal for the white voting residents of a territory to determine whether it should be admitted as a slave or a free state. In 1857, Supreme Court Dred Scott decision denies citizenship to African Americans. In 1859, the first successful U.S. oil well is drilled in Pennsylvania. In 1860, short-lived Pony Express runs from Missouri to California. In 1861, South Carolina batteries fire on U.S. fort, initiating the Civil War. Southern states secede from the Union and found the Confederate States of America. In 1861 to 1865, the country is embroiled in civil war. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation and the Battle of Gettysburg. In 1865, the 13th Amendment is passed that abolishes slavery in the United States. In 1866, completion of 2 successful transatlantic cables and the Civil Rights Act movement. In 1868, the 14th Amendment grants citizenship to those born or naturalized in the United States. In 1869, the first transcontinental railroad is completed. The Central Pacific construction crews composed largely of Chinese laborers. Those are the events that took place between 1820 and 1865. Take care. Bye-bye.